What's up, everybody? Good morning. Happy Friday. It's Grade School Friday. It's a special early morning edition of Grade School Friday. So for any of you guys who are actually in my time zone, like my buddy Gadali, thanks for getting up with me. For everyone else, maybe you're happy to get to enjoy grade school a little bit earlier in your day or evening. Hi, everyone. Good to be with you. I'm really excited for our session. I'm bummed we didn't get to meet last week because I feel like last week was kind of a busy one here on the channel. We had some videos come out that there was a lot of good conversation around that I'm excited to pick up on today. So it's going to be a really good session. Gadali, how are you feeling? What's your caffeine level right now?
My caffeine level is currently at zero. I am fully on just straight manufactured pep.
Boy, you're on that organic pep.
Yes,
I'm
it's nothing but me.
I'm there with you this morning.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I ran out of beans yesterday. More than
Wow.
I know no one cares that much about the contents of my pantry, but I ran out of coffee beans. Told myself I got to make sure to get more coffee beans before tomorrow morning, and I didn't. So it's organic pep day, I guess.
All right. Good luck.
Yeah. Thanks. Who's in the house? I want to see who's here. I'm trying to get better about actually dropping into the chat and seeing who's in there. Okay. Ian's here. Peter's here. Lester's here. This is awesome. Okay. Oh, Simone. Amazing. Bruce. Super cool. Okay, guys. Well, what do you guys want to talk about? I'm going to open Resolve on my side just so I can feel like I'm doing something good. Gadali, do we have questions quite yet, or should I make up something fun to talk about?
Let's see. We've got some a little bit of questions coming in. Ian's asking, can we go over values and settings for setting up our own custom display presets for the viewing LUT? Apple's Studio Display and their XDR display main presets are different nit values from other displays.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously it's as you're observing, it's going to vary depending on your display, and I've only got my display to work with. But essentially, like near as I can tell, like the default position for like any Apple display I've tested is it has a P3 D65 primary set and white point, and it has a gamma 22 response is sort of like the native profile. So you really just want to get onto whatever that native profile is. Now on the XDR, I'm sure that there's probably different options for like dynamic range, but really you just want to look for whatever is going to give you that. And you can actually you could go in and get geeky with your display profiles, but that's what you're trying to do is to find the, let's see here. I keep going to the wrong thing. Isn't it under displays? Here we go, display settings. You can go in and
Can we see the screen?
oh, I thought I flipped it over already. Oh boy, this organic pep just doesn't hit the same way as the other stuff. Okay, there we go. All right, so I'm looking at my preferences here, my display preferences, and I'm on Apple Display P3 600 nits. As you can tell from where I'm at here, I don't really care what it says, like in terms of nit value there. I would go in and calibrate, like if I were to do a proper calibration of this monitor, I could calibrate brightness to actually get to, whatever, like 100 nit or 120 nits that I might want in a dim surround like this one. But this is basically what you want to look for. You want to look for whatever your native is. Probably when you first bought your monitor or your machine and you turned it on, that's the profile that you want to be using. I can't swear that that will always work in all operating systems on all displays, henceforth forevermore. But that's like generally what I've found to be where you want to go is like to the default, because that's going to be a P3D65 Gamma 22, which is going to be accurate to that spec to a reasonable extent. And then you can work upstream from there, as we talked about in that video. And just before we move on and talk about other questions, I do just want to emphasize and get on the record once more. I feel like my grade school crowd, you guys are good readers, good listeners, and you're probably way ahead of me on this. But I just want to emphasize two things. First, we know that our discussion last week about the, getting a more accurate image out of your Apple display, That's, of course, different than a conversation about gamma shift. So the difference would be, is the image that I'm seeing, for example, right now on this display, is this an accurate reproduction of the display spec that I am? Is this an accurate reproduction of my image, put most sensibly? That's the question we were focused on in that video. The other question that comes up a lot and, of course, relates to it is, how do I ensure that I get that same reproduction elsewhere? But that's a separate conversation. That's a different conversation than the 20 minutes that we spent talking about getting a more accurate image while grading inside of Resolve on our display. And the only thing that I'll add to that, because we had this come up a lot, is like, well, why are you even breaking those apart? Why not cover them all in one piece? Or why not cover the matching before you cover the accuracy? The issue is this, like, I'm actually working, I'll give you guys a little spoiler alert. We are working on a document that for the moment I'm calling the Gamma Shift Guide. That is a comprehensive document that says, okay, what problem are you having? Here are the potential culprits. Here are the solutions to each of those individual problems. It's complex, guys. It has a lot of inputs and causes, and there's not just one thing that is causing the issue. For example, we tend to talk a lot about how, like, oh, the QuickTime gamma bug, for example, causes QuickTime to read NCLC tags incorrectly and to reproduce the image incorrectly. That's real, that's valid, and we're probably all familiar, or many of us are familiar with ways that we can game that to get a better result. But that's just specific to QuickTime. That's different than what other people may be referring to when they talk about the gamma shift issue. So the gamma shift issue has a lot of inputs, a lot of causes, and a number of potential fixes, some of which are more functional than others. So I'm working on that gamma shift guide right now as a comprehensive one-stop source for resolving those issues. But the reason I bring all that up right now is the first step in the solution to any of those gamma shifts that we're talking about, any of those ways that you can get a different reproduction of your image once you've rendered than you saw when you mastered it. The first thing that you have to have before you can get have any hope of an accurate reproduction elsewhere is you have to have an accurate reproduction to begin with. Otherwise, you're now tasked with getting a match to an image which was itself, or to a rendering, I should say, which was itself inaccurate. Does that make sense? Now you're trying to get another system to do it wrong in the same way that the first system did it wrong. If you can get the first system to do it right, meaning Resolve, meaning your Apple Display or your reference monitor, whatever it may be, then you simply need to get the other systems, whether that's an iPad or a web browser or a phone or whatever, you just need to get them to do it correctly as well. So that's why I emphasize that the starting point for any solution to the gamma shift issue is to get an accurate image when you're grading, and then you work forward from there and say, okay, how do I keep it accurate? You guys are probably all way ahead of me there, but wanted to get on the record. What else we got?
All right. We've got a question. Yeah, I have a pair of Apple Thunderbolt displays from the Stone Age. How do I find if they're able to display P3? Basically, how do you see what your primaries for your monitor are?
Oh, that's a good question. So there's two things that you can do there. First of all, I mean, the answer to pretty much any question we could ask about displays, like, how do I measure? How do I know? How do I ensure? The way we do those things is with calibration. And actually, this is a great spot just to quickly bring up. The next round of the Colorist Career Accelerator is coming up really, really soon. In just a couple weeks, you're going to start to see more information about that here on the channel and on my email list if you're a part of that email list. If you're not, get on my email list. We talk about lots of cool stuff on there if you don't get your fill of color grading geekery on Friday mornings here with me in grade school. But regardless, the Colorist Career Accelerator course is coming up, and it's going to be really cool. And what I wanted to bring up pursuant to this topic is we talk in the course about minimum viability a lot and what you actually need to start charging clients and working as a professional colorist. And one of the things that I'm really emphatic about is you have to have a calibration solution. You really need to have the ability to calibrate yourself rather than paying a calibrator every time you want to get a reality check or a gut check on your image. And one of the paths that I will actually propose in the Colorist Career Accelerator involves starting with a calibration solution even before you get a reference monitor. Because even after you get a reference monitor, you're going to need a calibration solution, and the calibration solution can be a perfectly sensible way to start. Reason I mention that right now, if you are getting your, if you're looking at your pair of Thunderbolt displays or whatever it may be, and you want to see where it's at, I'm going to show you one trick that you can use to get a general sense for the display profile that is being used. But if you want to actually know how well that display is performing, you need to measure it. You need to put a probe on it and see what it's doing. So that's the annoying answer, is that at the end of the day, you really need to measure. And that's the reality for like even anything else that we talked about with regard to getting your Apple display to be more accurate. As I mentioned in the video, I would not encourage you to use the workflow that I shared in that video to do professional color grading work, because you need to actually validate that the image is accurate, and you actually need to get it a little bit more accurate than even the accuracy that I'm saying you can expect to get with setting things up as I showed you and using the LUT that I showed you. But I want to show you one other thing here that you can use as a general guideline. Let me make sure you can see my screen, right? Yeah. Now, bear with me, because I'll have to remember exactly what this thing is called. I think it's called like display first aid. Gadeli, do you know what I'm fumbling for right now? It's like a profiles.
Yeah, I think it's in the utilities folder.
Let's go check.
Is it color sync utility?
Maybe it's color sync utility. Yep, beautiful. So you can actually look in here, like for example, if I wanted to see Apple Display P3 600 nits, if I wanted to actually see what that profile is, that is display P3. And I can actually open this and I can see the information within, and I'm trying to remember all the nitty-gritty details, but there actually is a way to look at, yeah, I mean, in this case, P3 is sort of evident, but you can actually go in and look at these tri-stimulus values and confirm, like, okay, these are the tri-stimulus values, the XYZs of, for example, P3, which I have checked these in the past and know they are. That's kind of a geeky side quest, but if you wanted to actually, if you find your native profile and it doesn't have the word P3 in it, which it likely will, then you actually can open the profile inside of Color Sync Utility and look at your red, green, and blue points and see where they're measuring. As a complement or as a sort of like meager substitute to calibration. But really the easiest thing to do is just to put a probe on it and see where it's coming in and operate from there. So I hope that's helpful.
All right. Question here. In your last video, you said output color space should be gamma 2.2 if your display is in 2.2. Is Resolve not ICC aware? Does it not show 2.4 if your calibration is set to gamma 2.2?
I'm not sure I 100% follow the question.
I think that's about the use Apple display preferences. So if the monitor is set to 2.2, does it not know to display something else if you want your output to be gamma 2.4?
I see what you're saying. It does know that in theory, but it will be, I'll put it to you this way, it gets a little bit hairy, but basically the same kind of wrong that we saw when we targeted 2.2, and there was like that little extra thickness in the shadows that the macOS viewing LUT that I gave to you guys remedies. You'll see that same issue going from when if Resolve tells ColorSync I am gamma 2.4 and ColorSync says, well, I know that I need to spit out 2.2, so I'm going to make a gamma correction in there. ColorSync will do an almost correct job of that, except for in the very deepest shadows. It's essentially, this is a whole other fun thing to bite off that we can if you guys are interested. What's actually happening there is it's attempting to decode a forward sRGB encoding, which is very, very close to a gamma 2.2 or a gamma 2.1, that type of territory, but it has a little bit of a variation down there in the very low end. So that's actually what we're seeing. But short answer, yes, it is aware of and pays attention to your gamma tag, even if that's not gamma 2.2. But the way that it makes that adaptation is the same kind of wrong that the macOS viewing transform fixes. I simply, for the purposes of that video, if we're saying, well, we're grading on this display and we're going for web, I just don't see any reason to involve gamma 2.4 at all. But you could put it this way, you could use the Gamma 2.4, you could use a Gamma 2.4 target and apply that LUT with similar results as long as you're like managing the rest of the pipeline properly.
Okay, we have a few questions about people using a Mac but having some other non-Apple monitor connected. Does this workflow still apply?
I would say less so in that case, simply because like you can connect any monitor that you wish into a Mac display. So could that be an accurate monitor? Certainly. Could that be a very inaccurate monitor or a sub P3 monitor? Absolutely. Could that be a monitor where you've gone in and flipped the hard menu settings to something completely zany? It could be. So I would say it really doesn't apply there. That's one where I would really only feel comfortable if I was looking at a like calibration report for that display. So I think this is pretty confined to Apple displays.
Question from Sesko. What do the color tag and gamma tag do in the export tab of Resolve?
Oh, that's a good question to talk about. And we're going to cover some of this stuff in a dedicated focus video. But the color space tags in the deliver page, I mean, first of all, we can get a little bit of context. I'm going to go over to the deliver page in just a moment. But for example, I'm going to switch over to the color management style that we used in the Apple Display as Reference Monitor video last week. Okay, so I've got no color management happening here at the timeline level. And I'm just going to move this into a group for Airy and make sure I've got a complete pipeline. And once I've got this all set up, what we're going to do is go back into our project settings and observe something we've talked about before. When we're not color managing in our project settings, these don't seem to do anything super obvious, do they? Like if I change this to, especially if I have my display color profiles for viewers turned off, and if I go in and I change this to something zany like P3D65 4000 nits, watch the image. Image doesn't change, right? You can do the same thing with your timeline color space. Changing these things does not seem to have a direct influence or impact on the image, does it? So what gives with that? Well, as we've talked about here on the channel before, those settings, I'm going to turn the Mac display for color profiles back on, or color profile for viewers, I should say. What these are primarily going to affect are your color space aware tools. So your HDR zones, the color warper is going to change its behavior somewhat. That's the main place it's going to have effect. The other place that it will have effect is when we go over to deliver this project, and these are the tags that we're being asked about, color space tag and gamma tag. When this says same as project, does anyone know what that means? That means whatever you said here, basically. So if you don't change this right now, it's going to tag as Rec 709 Gamma 22. And here's one of the principles I'll tease out to you guys. I've talked about this here on the channel before, that I really think is helpful to sort of like anchor this process of like, how do I get an accurate image when I'm grading? And how do I ensure that everyone else sees as close to that as they possibly can, regardless of what website or device or platform they happen to be watching the material on? That's a very complex question to answer, right? One of the principles, one of the constraints that I really believe we should apply in that situation is we shouldn't try to game the system. We should tag honestly. If I am outputting Rec 709 Gamma 22 and I'm monitoring Rec 709 Gamma 22 on my Apple display or on my reference monitor, that's what should be in my tags. And what those tags are is their metadata that say, I am Rec 709 Gamma 22. That's really a good principle that we want to observe. Now, we already alluded today to the so-called QuickTime Gamma bug, where you get a bug specifically with Gamma 2.4, where QuickTime incorrectly interprets when I stick up my hand and say, hey, QuickTime, I'm Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. QuickTime basically goes, oh, cool, you're Rec 709 Gamma 196, aren't you? And although it doesn't even ask us that question, it just goes, okay, cool, I got this. You're gamma 196, even though we're saying I'm gamma 2.4, and then you get an incorrect reproduction. But that's a problem of QuickTime not knowing what to do with the correct information that you are providing to it. So the real solution there is to use a piece of software that works, would be my, sort of like common sense idea there. And that's one that I share with my clients all the time. Like, hey, I really encourage you not to view in QuickTime. View it on Frame. View it in some other application. If you insist on viewing in QuickTime, or if your client insists on viewing in QuickTime, that is one of the very few scenarios where you would indeed want to game these tags. And specifically, you would want to change your gamma tag to Rec 709A. And that basically tells QuickTime, hey, just don't do anything. Just leave the gamma alone. Just push it out to the screen. So that's one of a very narrow set of examples where I would contemplate changing this at all here and gaming it, because otherwise I am simply going to make it follow my project because I've taken the time to properly set it in my project and it is correct in my project. So I really don't want to game the system, because if I do that, the real reason for that is like, all right, if I send around an asset which is carrying metadata, which is lying about itself, it doesn't seem like a good bet to lay that at some point that lie will be taken at face value and the image will be incorrectly reproduced. Does that make sense? Like Rec 709A, for example, that's actually saying I have a gamma of around 1.96. If I deliver a file that was mastered in gamma 2.4 and it's walking around saying, hey, I'm gamma 196, I'm gamma 196, I'm gamma 196, sooner or later, some piece of software is going to pay attention to that tag and do what the tag tells it to do, and then you're going to get an incorrect reproduction, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself because you tagged it incorrectly. Does that make sense? Kind of as a guiding principle there. That's how I think about those tags. That's how those tags work and where they get their information from. And I could TLDR all of that simply to say, make sure that you set your output color space tag correctly in your color management, and make sure that you leave these things at their defaults unless you have a very good, very specific reason for doing otherwise.
All right. Is it correct that a monitor calibrated to display sRGB images and one calibrated to Rec 709 Gamma 2.2 should be exactly the same in their calibration?
Very good question. You could ask 5 different smart motion imaging professionals and get different answers on that. Let's geek out for a second here. sRGB is a messier function than gamma. Gamma is literally just apply a power to the image. So a gamma 2.2 just means apply a power of 2.2 to the image. sRGB has a funkier function to it on the encode side. So as a first principle, let's look at this. If we look at my output, and right now I'm gonna say gamma 2.2, okay? Let's call that my baseline. Let's save a still of that. Let's now go to sRGB for our output gamma. That's close but not identical, right? If I grab a still of that and we wipe between those, let me get a full screen wipe here. There's a little thickening happening down there in the toe, right? So I point that out just to emphasize forward encoding of gamma 2.2 and sRGB, those are not identical encodings. They're close, but they're not identical. Where things get tricky is depending on the display manufacturer, they may read sRGB. Like some guidelines say, oh, sRGB should be decoded as gamma 2.2, or sRGB should be decoded as sRGB. So there's a whole school of thought out there, or a whole line of reasoning that says essentially this: when you're working in sRGB, you're just adding a little bit of extra crunch in the toe that is just going to stay in there even after the display undoes what you did to encode for it. So that's one type of sRGB display. The other type of sRGB display is one that expects a Rec 709 primaries sRGB as its input, but is not planning on like symmetrically decoding that sRGB. It's planning on just applying a inverse gamma 2.2 to the image, in which case that would be identical to a Rec 709 Gamma 22 image, because that's what a Rec 709 Gamma 22, or excuse me, that would be identical to a Rec 709 Gamma 22 display, because that's what a Rec 709 Gamma 22 display does. So the short answer is it depends. It depends on the display and how you've got it set up. My personal contention, since we've already talked about sRGB twice today, the world would be a better place if there were no such thing as sRGB. It serves no purpose whatsoever. Just go with Gamma 2.2. Go with Gamma 2.1 if you like it. Don't use sRGB at all. There's no reason to have it. As long as you have a symmetrical encode and decode, then you're good to go. sRGB just makes it really difficult to know that you're getting that, because there's disagreement in the spec about what forward sRGB encoding means and what inverse sRGB encoding or sRGB decoding means. One school of thought says sRGB decode is just the inverse of the sRGB encode. Another school of thought says sRGB decode is asymmetrical to the sRGB encode, and there's going to be a little bit of a difference as the net of going forward and then inverting that sRGB. And if that all sounds complicated and like a headache to think about, I agree with you. I think it's a massive pain. That's why I say just pick a Gamma or pick some other, like encoding spec that doesn't have that like variability, or doesn't have that ambiguity built into it. So that's my long answer there. Your sRGB display might be decoding Gamma 2.2, or it might be decoding sRGB.
Okay. Josh is saying that sounds like he's been using Rec 709 as his export color space and Gamma across platforms. How is that different than setting it to Gamma 2.2 or 2.4?
So, good question. If we look at something in Resolve here, let's say Rec 709 Gamma 2.4, and just look at our image in this state. Let's go to a fresh frame here. Okay, so here's my sRGB, or my 709 Gamma 2.4. I'm going to grab a still of this. Check this out. If I flip to Rec 709, I want you to watch two things. We're going to compare what happens to the image in just a moment, but watch my forward OOTF button, the forward OOTF checkbox. It automatically unticks, okay? And if I wipe between these two images, they're identical. So Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 with forward OOTF is identical to Rec 709 with forward OOTF turned off. Now, I have not tested the gamma tagging situation. My assumption that I would want to check before I go on the record with this, but my assumption is that the NCLC tags, that's the actual like metadata that we were talking about a moment ago, that those tags are going to be identical whether you are tagged as, whether you have like, if you take Cullen's advice and you say like, all right, my output, I'm going to leave to same as project, and I'm simply going to tag my output color space as Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. Yeah, I mean, look, interestingly, there actually is no straight up Rec 709 tag in here. So that I think kind of validates for us right there. That's going to give the same NCLC tags as if you are mastering to Rec 709. In fact, you essentially have to pick this because there is no straight up Rec 709 here in your output color space. So I think that kind of closes the loop, because here and here are the only place that you can even tag for Rec 709. Oh, interesting. It is here though, isn't it? Okay, well, here's what I would say then. Since it is here, first of all, I would prefer, as we already talked about, not to game these tags and split them off from what I'm doing in the project settings. But I would also say, even if you do this, and if you do a render of your project with these settings, and then you do a render of your project with these settings where the gamma tag is 2.4, I would highly suspect that the NCLC tag is going to be identical in those two cases. Something I would want to double check before I stake my life on it, but that would be my guess there.
Okay. Peter is wondering, if you grade a calibrated display to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 that's going through a video I/O device to bypass color sync, would you still do a separate export for web with I suppose, Gamma 2.2?
Yes. Okay. I was hoping we'd get to talk about this today. So there'll be a video on this hopefully in the near future, but there's a couple of considerations when we go to answer that question. What Peter is asking is, if I'm just doing a normal, like professional image mastering workflow, and I'm mastering Rec. 709, Gamma 2.4, and that's what my display is set up to, that's what I'm targeting over here. I've rendered it out, it looks great on my display, everyone's happy. Now we need to do a deliverable for the web. Do we want to do a separate render with a different gamma tag? There's two answers to that question. The first answer is probably yes. Like the first answer is like, it would seem so, because most of the devices that web presentation, that most of the web devices that are going to be viewing that content have a response of 2.2, not of 2.4, right? So wouldn't we want to match our Gamma 2.4, or wouldn't we want to match our target to what that display actually is? There's very few like web devices that actually have a Gamma 2.4 response. So it would seem the answer is yes when we look at it through that lens, right? Here's where it gets a little bit confusing, and where the potential answer may be different. I have lights on in the room right now so that you guys can see my face, such as it is. But when I'm grading, of course, I'm grading in a dim surround. It's very, very dark in here when I'm grading. That's what the environment that most colorists grade in. On the web, it's not just a difference of gamma in terms of like the viewing, the way that people are going to be viewing that content. The surround conditions are also going to be different, aren't they? They are generally going to have a moderate to bright surround. We don't know if they're going to be outside or indoors, but they're not going to be in a completely daylight controlled dark room like when we're color grading. So you have two things that you now have to compensate for if you're doing a deliverable for web. You want to compensate for the gamma response of the majority of the displays that are going to be viewing that web content. That's number one. But you also want to compensate for the change in viewing surround, because when you change viewing surround, it changes the way the image feels, okay? Generally speaking, you're going to want to see a boost in your image when you have a brighter surround so that it holds up in that environment. So there's a school of thought that says intentionally mismatching your encode with your decode is a sensible way to achieve that. Because when I look at this here, I'm trying to think of a sensible experiment here. I mean, like basically what you're gonna see is a little bit of a boost. You're essentially going to see the difference between this and that. It's just going to get a little bit more open in there. There's a school of thought that says that's a pretty reasonable sort of poor man's compensation for that brighter viewing surround. So through that lens, master Rec. 709 Gamma 2.4 on your Rec. 709 Gamma 2.4 display in a dim environment. And then when you're creating a deliverable for web, leave the encoding at 2.4, and know that by having that intentional mismatch of a 2.4 encode that's going to be decoded as 2.2 by most of the devices that watch it on the web, that's actually going to give you a somewhat appropriate compensation for the difference in viewing surround. Okay, that's the school of thought there. That's why this topic gets a little bit more confusing. I'll give you my take on this. I think that gamma encode and decode should always be symmetrical. If you're going to be decoding 2.2, encode 2.2. This is the same line of reasoning that makes me say get rid of sRGB, because at least in some cases it seems that it's calling for an asymmetrical encode and decode. You should always have a symmetrical encode and decode. And then if you need to compensate for surround conditions, like if I grade this to 709 Gamma 2.4 in this environment, and then I need to do a 709 Gamma 2.2 master that also will be viewed in a brighter surround, what I'm generally going to do is turn on the lights and see how it looks, and then do a trim, just one single node for all the shots in the timeline that's going to massage and maneuver that low end of the image to make it look the same in that bright surround as it did to me in the dim surround. So I like to separate out those issues, but the very commonly accepted wisdom, even though in my opinion it's like not correct, is to game gamma encoding, to get gamma encoding asymmetrical as a sort of crude form of surround compensation. Boy, long answer there, but it's kind of complex.
Question from Ian. Is there a reason not to put the viewing LUT on the timeline level instead of where you recommended in the video? Seems like it would be way easier to toggle it on and off in the timeline nodes.
Oh yeah, no, you could totally do it at the timeline level. That, in fact, is where I would do it for like practical purposes, and that way you can just kick it off when you've done your pass on your Apple display, and you can render it out with it turned off. Yeah, glad you brought that up, actually.
Cool. Lester says he's still confused about which of the boxes to check in the advanced settings of the CST or the apply forward OOTF, etc.
Okay. In the advanced section, of course, this is going to be context dependent, but I'll give you the sort of like guidelines for how you're going to be using these. First principle, OOTF. This applies to the first two checkboxes, okay? OOTF is only something that's even a possibility. You should only even consider turning one of these on or both of these on, really never both of them, it's just one. You should only even be considering that if you are moving from a scene or a camera space into a display space, which is what's happening right now, right? I'm going from a scene space, DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, into a display space. That is a scenario in which it would be sensible. There's at least merit to thinking about the OOTF side of things, okay? Same thing in reverse. The only other scenario would be if you are going from a display space to a scene or camera space, okay? Those are the only two situations where you even want to consider your OOTF. If you're going from a camera space to a scene space, like Arilog C3 to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, never an OOTF. If you're going from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate to Red Wide Gamut, never an OOTF. They're both in a scene space or a camera space. They don't need the OOTF, the opto-optical transfer function or the system gamma, okay? Same thing on the display side. If you're going from Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 to P3D65 Gamma 2.2, no OOTF. You're already on the display side of the river, if that makes sense, and you don't need to have any OOTFs whatsoever, okay? So the only situation where you might use OOTFs is when you're going from scene space to display space or from display space to scene space. That's principle number one. Principle number two, when should we actually use these individual pieces? In general, if you are going from scene space to display space, you're going to want to apply this forward OOTF. That's just like a general like path to getting a rendering that feels reasonable to us when we are color grading. If you look at this image with the OOTF turned off, and let's really just level things out, and I'm going to turn off any like look ingredients here, and then just make sure that I've got, that's why this was looking kind of funky. It wasn't being properly input mapped. So we're now looking at our image, and let's turn off this display color profiles for now. So we're now looking at just a flat render of this image. Let me just make sure that that's happening correctly now. Yeah, so we're now just looking at this flat rendering of the image, and you can see like this doesn't feel quite right. This feels like a more sensible, like display normalized image. So forward OOTF generally wants to be on if you're going from camera space or scene space into display space, okay? Only notable exception there really would be one that we just talked about a minute ago. Rec 709 has that OOTF built into it. All right, so that one it's gonna automatically uncheck when you flip over to Rec 709, and if you turn it back on, it's gonna start looking funky. But that's really the only exception I can think of to turning forward OOTF on when you are going from scene or camera space into display space. Okay, inverse OOTF. Inverse OOTF, the only time you're going to be using this is when you are going from a display space back to a scene space or to a camera space. But you're not always going to use it. To be honest with you, you're going to use it when it helps, because as we've talked about here on the channel before, mapping or color managing a display state image back into a scene state, there's no closed solution to that because you don't know how it got into the form that it's in now. So you can't undo what was done to it, right? So inverse OOTF, like you can see I think I've got some Rec 709 stuff here on this timeline. Maybe not, maybe I scrubbed it out. Okay, I don't have any Rec 709 stuff in here, but if I did, I would essentially go from, I mean, I'll give you an example here. Here's, like how I might go about color managing a Rec 709 piece of material to get it into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Turn some tone mapping on, do something like this. And then the inverse OOTF, you can see that's basically just going to open up the contrast. It's going to undo what the forward OOTF does, which is to add some weight in the bottom end of the image. So it's just going to undo that. That's something that you can use or not as the image guides you. If it looks good with it, if it looks better with it on than with it off, leave it on. If it doesn't look good, then turn it off. Okay. So that's your OOTFs. White point adaptation. This one's pretty straightforward. Most of the color spaces that you are going to be moving in between with a color space transform share a white point. So in most cases, this checkbox is not going to do a darn thing. That's certainly the case here. If you're ever wondering if your eyes are fooling you, of course, you can pull up your scopes and validate or verify that you're not seeing any change here. But that's generally not going to have much effect when you're using a color space transform because most of these color spaces are in D65, most of the common color spaces that we use. One notable exception would be if you happen to be doing anything with ACES, that has a different white point. So you could see if I was saying, oh, I want to do AP0. And if you look at this white point adaptation, you can see that's actually moving my vector scope because AP0 has a white point of around D60 as opposed to Rec 709, which is a white point of around D65. So generally speaking, this is not going to have much effect. And if you are moving in between spaces with differing white points, then you'll generally want to turn it on. So I hope that helps overview those pesky advanced checkboxes there.
Okay. If you're working with lower quality footage, will the proper color managed space help with problems like banding?
Oh, that's a fun question. Without a very fun answer. No, it won't. Like you're moving your image into a larger color space is not going to make the image more robust. If the image has tearing or artifacting or banding or other issues associated with low bit depth or poor acquisition, moving into a larger color space isn't going to fix it. But what it will do is give you the best possible opportunity to work with what you have. So if you've got banding, you are no worse off having it in your DaVinci Wide Gamut space than you are having it in your original scene or rather your original display space or your whatever it was originally captured in. And you may actually find it easier to do your work underneath there or within that color space. So it's not going to fix anything, but it will give you the best possible opportunity to get things looking their best, if that makes sense.
Okay, question about HDR. Can we edit HDR on the latest M2 MacBook Pro without any reference monitor or any other of the recent Apple monitors, I suppose, which also say they do high nit values or HDR?
No. HDR is a difficult space for a variety of reasons, but the main ones are that it's difficult unless you're working in it's difficult no matter what. But if you are working in like the way that I was introduced to HDR when I started working in it, I don't know, now probably almost 10 years ago, like if you're mastering something for like Netflix or whomever, they're going to tell you exactly what they expect in terms of the deliverable. They're going to say, this is what we need in order to reproduce an HDR image on our platform and have it look correct. So that part, those specs are not always easy to hit, and there's a lot of details you have to go into, but as long as you can produce an image with those characteristics, then you're going to be good to go. near as I can tell, like the last I looked, and full disclosure, it's been at least a couple months, but the last I look, I assume we're talking about, like doing HDR sort of on a like hobbyist basis. You're not talking about delivering to a streamer, as I just mentioned. The problem is that it's very difficult to get a sense for like, all right, what color space metric is required for me to deliver HDR to YouTube or wherever, and what metadata, as we've been talking about in this episode, what metadata has to be baked in there so that regardless of whatever flavor of HDR I master and can master here, so that that's going to reproduce one-to-one. That's the first challenge, is even if I have an HDR master that I accurately mastered and that I can trust that what I was looking at was accurate, how do I actually get that to travel? There's doesn't seem to really be a solution to that for like HDR for platforms like YouTube. The other challenge is that when you're mastering the HDR in the first place, you need to have a way to validate what you're getting. So I guess I'll backpedal my hard no answer a little bit. If you can calibrate your display and get it to reliably reproduce the characteristics of the HDR standard that you are mastering for, and that's the standard that you are pushing out to for YouTube or wherever, then maybe. I just haven't quite seen all those dots get connected yet of like, hey, YouTube will accept a P3 D65 1000 nit master with the following metadata, and it will faithfully reproduce that on all the gazillion devices that people view YouTube content on. So you just need to produce a P3 D65 1000 nit master, and then on the mastering side, you would simply need to solve for like, all right, how do I'm gonna have to measure and then calibrate a display that can actually do that. And of course, one of the big crises, this is not just in the lower end of the market, everywhere, like for professionals as well, there really aren't a ton of great options out there for HDR mastering displays right now. So HDR is a really exciting but kind of a problematic space. But certainly, can you master HDR accurately on a MacBook Pro or on an XDR display, something like that, and then get it to reproduce correctly on a platform like YouTube? I'm sure in some set of controlled laboratory conditions it can be done, but I sure don't know how. And we've looked into it to a pretty in-depth extent. It's just tricky stuff. A lot of things to solve for, but let me know if you end up continuing to pursue that and you discover some solutions there, because I'm very interested in the space, but it's just hard to do.
Question from Kevin. Do any cameras today still encode 709 profiles in gamma 1.96, or was this just a thing that happened in the 90s and now Apple is just trying to follow specs from white papers?
That's a good question. I don't actually, if there are cameras that do that, I'm not aware of them. The thing is, like, most cameras that like shoot 709, they're trying to give you a display ready image. So like probably none of them, like I'm thinking about, like iPhones or other smartphones or, like other devices like that. None of them are going to have just a simple gamma encoding on there, because they're trying to give you an optimized, image, like display ready image. So long way of saying no, I don't think there's any camera like on the market right now that truly captures Rec 709 at a gamma of around a 1.96, and like you could treat it as such, and that would be a meaningful thing. I think that's a bygone deal, and I think you are correct that like there's just this legacy standard. By the way, like if we want to get geeky, Rec 709, that is the like the implicit gamma. There actually was never a gamma stipulated for Rec 709, but the conventional gamma for Rec 709 was 1.96-ish. Really, if we want to get geeky, it would be more appropriate to talk about BT 1886, which calls for Rec 709 with a gamma 2.4 encoding, because Rec 709 actually never has had a gamma spec stipulated, and the conventional one actually was 1.96, so that may be part of it as well. That's actually probably the most principled gamma to use if you're going strictly by the book of Rec 709. Really what we should all be saying is BT 1886. But for some reason, none of us do, me included. I'm just used to saying 709, I guess.
Let's see. I guess discussion point on HDR as well. Andy is saying HDR doesn't look like real life, at least to me. It looks very artificial. Am I the only one?
I don't think you're the only one. HDR is... It's so funny that we're getting to talk about HDR today, because I've been thinking about this subject a lot this week. I'm working with it a lot. You know, like we're in a fun era with displays, with HDR and some of the projects that I'm working on right now of next generation displays that have larger color gamuts. And the same thing comes up in both cases. When you give me a display that has a bigger box of crayons, or you give me a display that has a greater dynamic range, like an HDR display, like that's cool. I'm glad that exists. I'm glad to have more to work with, but that's where like taste becomes really, really important. And it actually becomes harder to get a great artful rendering of your image, because there's so many more possible renderings of your image than with SDR, if that makes sense. So with HDR, there is a flavor of HDR that I love, that I wish I could master everything in and never have to be limited to 100 nits. But when I flip you in between like your SDR and your HDR for a show, and it's kind of like tailored to what I think is appropriate, you're not going to see a big change. The body of the image is going to stay in the exact same place. This is a whole other like debate with HDR that I think has mostly been settled. But there was a really vocal school of thought for like a while with HDR that actually felt that HDR meant that the image should be brighter. Like if you want to call it the exposure of the image, the way that the display rendered the display exposure of the image should actually go up, because that's cool for some reason. I feel like no one is really arguing that anymore. I haven't heard that argument in a while, and I'm glad, because it's a dopey argument. But that was a whole school of thought with HDR of like, oh, the image itself should be brighter. And that was some of my first exposure to HDR, was people saying, you got to check out HDR. It lets you make your image brighter. And me looking at the brighter image and going, cool, that looks terrible. So that's its own issue that hopefully is being set aside. But when we set that aside, I think maybe some of the other things that can feel problematic or not that fun about HDR is like you get these really screaming hot, kind of aggressive, sharp, stabbing highlights when you flip into HDR mode. Like 1000 nits is a very, very bright image. That's a common HDR display standard. So in our mind's eye, if I flip you in between my SDR and my HDR rendering of your image, and I show you what I think the HDR should be, you're not going to see much change. Really what you're going to see is some little twinkles and sparkles come to life depending on like where the speculars in the image are. So it would be things like, you know, what else do I have in this timeline here? Maybe not need necessarily like great examples in this timeline. Let's add this to my Airy group, and let's flip some of our look. Like if I flip on the HDR, you're really just going to see like some of this highlight back here and some of these speculars and things like this just get a little bit more open, like just a hair, so there's a little more twinkle, a little more seasoning in the image. I think that looks really good. I think it gives the eye something to grab onto and to connect with, but that's actually hard to do with HDR. You need to have some good tricks like at the system level so that you're generally not mastering to a full 1000 nits, at least that's my preference. And you need to have some really good control within Resolve to deal with like hot highlights when they come about, and have a good system for like rolling those in. And you know, you guys have heard me talk about it so much here on the channel. It's the question of like creamy versus pingy. You know, like HDR out of the box is going to give you very pingy highlights, where I generally prefer much creamier, much softer, much more kind of rolled over highlights with just enough sort of separation from the rest of the scene to create some visual interest. So that would be kind of like my 2 cents on that subject. But I hear you for sure. I think HDR it's tricky to do well. It's harder than SDR for sure.
Do you have any resources on how to actually calibrate your monitor?
So what I recommend there, we actually talk about this. This is a good thing to touch on again as we're reaching the end of our session here today. We go through this in depth, like step-by-step hand-holding in the Colorist Career Accelerator course, which is coming up, as I mentioned, in just a couple of weeks. So if you're interested in taking your color grading to the next level, if you're interested in working at a professional level as a colorist and getting well paid to do it, then definitely encourage you to get on the wait list for the course and check it out. But to go to the question about calibration, we go step by step through there, and what we recommend in the course and the calibration solution that I use is a solution called CalMan. It's made by a company called Portrait Displays. They have a companion probe that goes with it that makes the process pretty streamlined, pretty easy. I can tell you guys that from experience because this week I'm working on one of these prototype displays that I mentioned a moment ago, and there is no out-of-the-box calibration solution that's going to work for that thing. So we're having to go in and measure it and write stuff down and look at the trend lines and come up with solutions. It's very, very geeky and very, very not fun. And that is kind of the nature of calibration at its ground level. So CalMan and Portrait Displays make a good product that it's not the only good calibration product out there, but to be honest, the reason that I have gravitated toward it is because it's the most turnkey. Like I can go through a couple settings, and now that I know how to do it, it's quite automatic and there's very little interference needed from me. So that would be kind of my go-to for calibration, unless you want to go into the deep end of the swimming pool and start to understand like gamma decoding and, like the finer nuances of probes and measurement and calibration, which is like a whole galaxy of, motion imaging and color science that I haven't even gone fully into because it's a big one. And ultimately I just want to make pretty pictures. But that's what I would check out CalMan, check out, like the Portrait Displays products. I think they're really good. We got time for one more.
Okay. Question from Gabriel. Is there an inherent benefit to the color management video versus CSTs? And can you remind us of your CST settings for color management?
Sure. Yeah. So there is no inherent. I'm actually going to get to talk about this because it's I feel like come up again recently here on the channel. Resolve color management. Color managing here in your project settings. This is the exact same vehicles under the hood. It's using color space transforms under the hood. So it's no different than color managing in nodes. It just comes down to your preference. As I've shared with you guys before, I actually like to work in nodes, generally speaking, for my color management. Kind of helps me visualize what I'm doing. But if we just kind of go through like color management settings for color managing in nodes, we can see them right here. I happen to be using the groups feature, which I recommend if you are color managing in nodes, but you don't have to. But if you are, here's how it goes. I've got this shot, which has been added into a new group that I've called Airy. And I'm going to cancel this because I already have that group. When you add a shot into a group, you get two new buttons up here at the very top. So in addition to clip and timeline, you have group pre-clip and group post-clip. For color management, group pre-clip is an ideal place to apply your initial input transform because that's going to be the very first thing that hits the image. Anything you do here is going to happen before anything you do here at the clip level, which will happen before anything you do here at the group post-clip level, which will happen before anything you do here at the timeline level. Okay, so if I go back over here to the group pre-clip level, I'm using a color space transform, and I'm simply going from area wide gamut 3, area log C3, to DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. This is my camera color space. This is the working color space that I have selected. And because I'm going from a scene space to a scene space or a camera space to a scene space, I don't need any tone mapping or any gamut mapping. I don't even need to go back to our other discussion about the advanced settings here. I don't even need this white point adaptation because these share a common white point. Okay, so that's how I'm getting into my working space. Here at the clip level is where I will do all of my color grading which is now taking place inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Okay. And now to complete the journey, here at the timeline level for me, now we did a whole video on this recently about the different places you can apply macro level transformations. So you could do a group post clip, you could do an adjustment layer. There's a number of things that you could, another number of places that you could apply these final transforms to get out to your display. I'm doing them here at the timeline level. And the important one is this one, DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, Rec 7 or 9, Gamma 2.4 in this case, because I'm aiming at my reference monitor that's calibrated to Gamma 2.4. If you are aiming at your newly more accurate Apple display, like we talked about in last week's video, that would of course be a Gamma 2.2. Here's what I like to do for tone mapping. I like to assume a full dynamic range, a potential input value of up to 10,000 nits, and then I'm going to roll that into 100 nits, which is the typical domain for an output transform. And then for my saturation compression, I'm going to turn that on. This, by the way, if you want to get geeky, this is the one difference between the color management setup that I recommend in your project settings versus here. When you set up this same pipeline in your project settings, there's no saturation compression by default. I actually like having it on because it's going to sort of apply a little compression to colors that are getting toward the periphery of the gamut of your destination. So I think it's a helpful thing to have in there. And then we already did our deep dive on OOTFs and the white point adaptation. So that rounds out the journey. It's really just two pieces. We're making a sandwich. Input transform into working space, output transform to display space, grade in between, and apply a look immediately upstream of that final output transform. Okay, guys. Y'all are awesome. Thanks for being here this morning. Glad we got to chop some stuff up, discuss getting our Apple displays more accurate, discuss gamma and gamma shift and sRGB and gamma 2.2 and gamma 2.4 and surround compensation. Wow, we kind of covered a lot today. Thanks so much for being here, guys. Thanks for coming for the early morning edition. I'm off to more color grading adventures for the day, so I hope you guys have an awesome Friday and an awesome weekend. And I will see you back here on the channel next week. And thanks to Gidali for co-hosting with me. Take care, guys.